Welcome back to lecture number 11. This is topic 1.11, Global Africans. This is the last topic of Unit 1. The first of two learning objectives says to explain the reasons why Africans went to Europe and Europeans went to Africa before the onset of the transatlantic slave trade. We'll start with the Portuguese, who began their exploration of Africa in pursuit of gold. They were spurred by the tales of Mansa Musa and the images they had seen in the Catalan Atlas. Prince Henry, the navigator of Portugal in the 15th century, adopted many maritime innovations that had already been discovered or invented and widely used in Asia. He aimed to bypass the trans-Saharan trade routes for gold located in the old kingdoms of Ghana, Mali, and Songhai. Trade between West African kingdoms and Portugal in the late 15th century was another reason for Portuguese exploration of the African coast. The Portuguese established trade outposts like Elmina in modern-day Ghana, primarily seeking gold, but also other goods like cola nuts, salt, and textiles similar to those traded in the trans-Saharan routes. Most importantly, they began to look for enslaved people. African kingdoms increased their wealth and power through the slave trading. The Portuguese traded weapons with coastal African kingdoms, which were then used to enslave rivals in wars of expansion. Slavery existed on the African continent before the arrival of the Portuguese, as evidenced by ancient practices in Egypt and elsewhere. However, in West Africa, the nature of slavery was different from the later transatlantic slave trade. Enslaved people were usually prisoners of war who were integrated into the conquering society and could eventually attain influence, power, or freedom. Slavery was not inherited and was not based on skin color, not that racial solidarity existed yet. The demand for labor in African societies often stemmed from the need to increase agricultural production and support large-scale building projects. Enslaved people could also serve in various capacities, including as soldiers, artisans, and domestic workers. Europeans in West Africa began to get permission to build forts and trade outposts, though they were still subject to high mortality rates due to diseases like yellow fever and malaria. The Portuguese did not understand the mosquito-borne nature of these diseases yet. Nevertheless, they established outposts like those in Luanda and Elmina, as shown in the pictures. While the European presence increased in West Africa, there was also a growing population of sub-Saharan Africans in Europe, especially in Iberian port cities like Lisbon and Seville. Africans made up 20% of the population in Lisbon. Similarly to the way slavery was practiced in West African kingdoms, Portugal, a kingdom with a small population and a constant war with its larger neighbor Spain, found a population necessity for the people brought over from the West African coast. The population and presence of both Africans and Europeans increased over time due to continued trade between the two regions. African labor was crucial for the construction and maintenance of Portuguese infrastructure, including forts, churches, and public buildings. The integration of Africans into Portuguese society also influenced cultural practices, cuisine, and religious ceremonies. The demographics of Africans in Europe included two main groups: African elites and free and enslaved Africans. African elites included ambassadors and children of rulers who were there to settle diplomatic disputes or establish diplomatic relations. They also traveled to port cities for educational and religious reasons. For example, Afonso I sent his son to study Catholicism in Portugal, and he returned as a bishop. Free and enslaved Africans served in various roles such as domestic laborers, boatmen, guards, entertainers, vendors, and even knights. One of the earliest examples of a free black man with a title in Europe is Juan Garrido, who later became a conquistador in the exploration of North America and Mexico. The black Ladinos, Africans who lived in Spain and Portugal, were also significant. Many African elites who traveled to Europe played key roles in diplomatic missions and cultural exchanges, bringing new ideas and technologies back to their home countries. Africans in Europe also contributed to the arts, with some becoming musicians, dancers, and artists who influenced European cultural trends. African scholars and religious leaders often engaged in theological debates and helped to shape the early modern intellectual landscape in Europe. In some cases, African merchants and traders established successful businesses, integrating into the European economic system. The second learning objective is to explain how early forms of enslaved labor by the Portuguese shaped slave-based economies in the Americas. This began with the colonization of the islands of Cape Verde and São Tomé in the 15th century. After a failed attempt to take the Canary Islands from the Spanish, the Portuguese saw that crops like cotton, indigo, and especially sugar were extremely profitable. São Tomé was discovered by the Portuguese navigators João de Santarém and Pedro Escobar around 1470. The islands were initially uninhabited, making them ideal for the establishment of Portuguese colonies without resistance from indigenous populations. The fertile volcanic soil of São Tomé proved excellent for sugarcane cultivation, leading to the establishment of plantations worked by enslaved people. Some enslaved people escaped and formed maroon communities on the island, which carried out guerrilla attacks against plantations and inspiring more resistance from enslaved people. By the mid-16th century, São Tomé had become one of the world's leading sugar producers. However, due to the competition from Brazilian sugar plantations and frequent slave revolts, São Tomé's prominence in sugar production declined in the 16th century. São Tomé also became a significant center for the transport of enslaved Africans, who were later transported to Brazil and the Caribbean. Due to its geographic location far off the west coast of Africa and favorable ocean and wind currents, Cape Verde also became a launch point for the export of human captives. They were discovered by Portuguese explorers in 1456 and quickly became an important waypoint for ships traveling between Europe, Africa, and later to the Americas. The island's strategic location made them a crucial hub for the Atlantic slave trade. Cape Verde's economy was initially based on the export of slaves, salt, and agricultural products like cotton and indigo. Due to its arid climate, large-scale plantation agriculture was less viable, leading to a more diverse economy that included fishing, salt extraction, and transatlantic trade. Cape Verdean Creole culture developed as a blend of African and Portuguese influences reflected in language, music, and traditions. The islands also became a refuge for freed and escaped slaves who formed communities with a distinct Creole identity. By 1500, about 50,000 enslaved Africans had been removed to work on Portuguese colonized Atlantic islands and in Europe. The plantation system they created in places like São Tomé and Cape Verde became the model for slave labor-based economies in the Americas. These plantations, called factories or factorias in Portuguese, used up to 500 enslaved people with a division of labor within the factories. Enslaved people worked at every stage of sugar production, from growing sugar cane to harvesting and refining it into the sugar morsels. This system became a model for capitalism in the late 18th century. The success of these plantations demonstrated the profitability of a large-scale, slave-based agriculture, encouraging its expansion to the Caribbean and to the Americas. The technique and organizational methods developed in these early plantations were later adopted and refined in the New World. The economic success of São Tomé and Cape Verde also underscored the importance of maritime trade routes and the strategic position of these islands. And finally, here's the recap. The Portuguese started exploring African coasts in search of gold. Their increased trade between Africans and Portuguese led to Africans going to Europe and Europeans going to Africa. Initially, trade with Europe was mutually beneficial, but over time, Africans began to rely too much on European goods, and Europeans began to demand higher numbers of enslaved people. Africans in Europe included both elites and enslaved individuals. Later, the Portuguese began using enslaved labor in plantation systems in São Tomé and Cape Verde. By 1500, the foundation was set for the transatlantic slave trade. Thank you for watching. If you would like to watch the next lecture, click the thumbnail on the screen. And if you would like more resources to help you study, you can visit apushslides.com/afam. I wish you the best of luck with your studies, and I hope to see you back on the next lecture.